The kitchen table had seen better decades. Its surface bore the accumulated damage of 3 generations coffee rings that no amount of scrubbing could lift crayon marks from when Ethan's mother was young enough to color outside the lines knife scores from his grandmother cutting vegetables for Sunday dinners that stopped happening after cancer took her in '98. Now at 2:03 on a Thursday morning that felt like the 100th consecutive Thursday of Ethan Carter's life, the table served as his workshop for poverty's endless maintenance requirements. Grace's sneaker sat in the pool of yellow light from the overhead fixture, its canvas upper separated from the rubber sole in a gap that had finally grown too wide to ignore. The shoe was supposed to last until Christmas, another 3 months of wear extracted from materials that had already given everything they had. But poverty didn't respect timelines, and the adhesive that held working-class life together always failed faster than the budget allowed for replacement. Ethan's needle moved with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed this repair on every pair of shoes his daughter had owned since she started walking. Heavy thread designed for upholstery because it was stronger and lasted longer than the lighter weight stuff. Careful stitches that wouldn't rub against Grace's ankle. His hands calloused from the kind of work that destroyed bodies one shift at a time, moved automatically while his mind tracked numbers that never quite aligned with reality. 34 years old felt both impossibly young and devastatingly old depending on which mirror he looked into. The bathroom mirror showed someone who could still pass for late 20s if the light was dim and you didn't look too closely at the lines around his eyes. The mirror of his bank account showed someone ancient with exhaustion, someone whose youth had been spent on an installment plan that charged interest he'd never quite calculated when he was 20, and stupid and thought military service plus a paramedic certification equaled security. 3 years widowed. The phrase sat in his mind like a stone, smooth from constant handling, but no less heavy for its familiarity. 3 years since the drunk driver, 22 years old college student from Brookline, with parents wealthy enough to hire lawyers who reduced vehicular manslaughter to reckless driving, had T-boned Julia's sedan at an intersection she drove through every day on her way home from the hospital where she worked as an ICU nurse, saving other people's lives while her own leaked away into Boston traffic. 3 years since Ethan became the only parent Grace had left, the only buffer between his 6-year-old daughter and a world that measured worth in dollars and found them both catastrophically deficient. The manufacturing plant paid $18 an hour for work that required Ethan to be on his feet from 6 a.m. until 3 p.m. troubleshooting equipment that broke down because the company refused to invest in maintenance until catastrophic failure forced their hand. The package delivery service paid $14.50 an hour plus $1 per package for evening routes that ran from 4 until 11, driving his personal truck into neighborhoods where porch pirates and parking tickets were just operational costs of keeping food on the table. The odd repair, neighbors leaking faucets, broken appliances, anything mechanical that Ethan could fix with the tools in his truck, and the knowledge accumulated from a childhood watching his father work miracles with duct tape and determination, those paid cash under the table because everyone in this neighborhood understood that survival required flexibility in how you define legal employment. $42,000 last year, according to the tax return that had taken him 3 weekends to prepare, because paying someone to do it would have cost money better spent on things like shoes that didn't require surgical intervention to remain functional. $42,000 minus the $18,000 that went to rent for an apartment where the heat worked sporadically and the hot water required coaxing. Minus the $8,000 for groceries stretched across 52 weeks of meals, where protein was a luxury item and pasta was featured heavily because it was cheap and filling. And Grace didn't complain even though Ethan knew she was tired of spaghetti in all its endless variations. Minus the $6,000 for the truck's insurance and garden repairs that Ethan did himself because taking it to a shop meant labor costs that would double whatever the parts ran. Minus the $4,000 for utilities that climbed every winter when the landlord refused to insulate properly, and every summer when the ancient air conditioning unit struggled against humidity that made the apartment feel like breathing through wet cloth. Minus the $3,000 for Grace's school supplies and field trips and the endless small expenses that added up to thousands lunch money and book fare money and the fee for the spring concert and the cost of a costume for the class play. That left $3,000 to cover everything else. medical expenses for a 6-year-old who needed checkups and vaccinations, and the inhaler for the asthma that had appeared last year. Clothes that Grace grew out of faster than Ethan could budget for replacements. The emergency fund that was supposed to exist but never quite materialized because emergencies kept happening faster than savings could accumulate. $18,000 in debt remaining from Julia's cancer treatment, the deductibles and copays, and the experimental therapy that insurance refused to cover because experimental meant unproven, and unproven meant someone else's problem. The debt collectors had stopped calling after Ethan set up the payment plan, $50 a month, that would take him 30 years to pay off if he never missed a payment, and they never added interest, which they did monthly at a rate that meant the balance never actually decreased, no matter how faithfully he sent his checks. The needle paused mid-stitch as Ethan's vision blurred with exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. This was the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been running on fumes for 3 years, who woke at 4:30 every morning and didn't stop moving until midnight or later, who measured his life in hours worked versus bills paid, and found himself perpetually short on both sleep and money. Grace's baby shoes sat in the drawer to his right, white leather now yellowed with age, impossibly small, the first pair Julia had bought when their daughter learned to walk at 10 months. Ethan reached out and touched them with one oil-stained finger, the morning ritual that kept Julia's memory from fading into the general blur of exhaustion and grief. Some men kept photographs on their nightstands or wore their wedding rings years after death made the vows null and void. Ethan kept baby shoes in a kitchen drawer and touched them every morning before the sun rose, whispering words to a wife who'd been dead longer than some marriages lasted. Still here, still fighting, still keeping the promise we made. The promise had been simple. No matter what happened, Grace would have every opportunity they could give her. Education stability. The chance to dream bigger than a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots occasionally punctuated summer nights. Julia had been fierce about that promise, making Ethan swear on their daughter's first birthday that if anything happened to her, he wouldn't give up, wouldn't let poverty or grief or the 1,000 daily humiliations of being broke determine what their daughter could become. Ethan had sworn, thinking that death was theoretical, something that happened to other people in other families. He'd sworn while Julia blew out candles on a grocery store cake and Grace smashed frosting into her hair, and the future stretched out before them like a promise that couldn't break. 3 years later, keeping that promise meant sewing shoes at 2 a.m. while his daughter slept in the next room, dreaming dreams that Ethan could barely afford to let her have. It meant working 3 jobs that collectively paid less than one decent job would have if decent jobs existed for high school graduates with paramedic certifications they no longer used and mechanical engineering degrees they'd never completed because life had other plans. It meant measuring coffee grounds to make them last, watering down milk to stretch it further, saying no to every request that came with a price tag while watching his daughter's face learn to stop asking. The final stitch pulled through canvas, and Ethan tied it off with the neat knot his father had taught him 30 years ago, back when showing a boy how to fix things was still considered valuable knowledge instead of obsolete skill in a world that preferred replacement to repair. He held the shoe up to the light, examining his work with critical eyes that had once assessed collapsed buildings for structural integrity and now assessed children's footwear for its ability to last 3 more months. Good enough. Everything in Ethan's life was good enough because excellent required resources he didn't have, and adequate was a luxury he couldn't always afford. The shoes would hold. Grace would wear them to school without the other kids noticing that they'd been repaired, without enduring the particular cruelty children reserved for classmates whose poverty showed through the gaps. The clock read 2:14 a.m. Ethan had been awake for 21 hours and 44 minutes, give or take the 10-minute power nap he'd grabbed in the truck between delivery stops. The shift at the manufacturing plant started in 4 hours and 16 minutes, which meant he should sleep now if he wanted to function tomorrow. But his brain was still calculating expenses and timelines and the impossible mathematics of making $42,000 cover the cost of raising a child in a city where the median household income was $78,000 and climbing. The apartment breathed around him with sounds that 3 years of residence had rendered familiar. The radiator clanking as it tried to heat rooms, whose windows leaked cold air through gaps. The landlord refused to seal the couple upstairs, fighting in muffled Spanish about money or infidelity, or whatever people with more energy than sense fought about at 2 a.m. the distant wail of sirens heading toward whatever disaster was unfolding in some other pocket of the city's endless emergencies. Ethan stood joints protesting movement after too long sitting and crossed to the sink to wash the thread residue from his hands. The faucet dripped with metronomic persistence, another repair he needed to make, but kept postponing because the parts cost money and the leak wasn't bad enough yet to justify the expense. Everything was triage in the economics of poverty. Everything evaluated on a scale of urgent versus merely necessary versus someday if resources permit. He dried his hands on a towel that had been white when Julia bought it 5 years ago and was now the gray of things that got washed too many times with insufficient detergent, then moved to the refrigerator to assess tomorrow's lunch situation. Half a loaf of bread that was approaching the edge of acceptable freshness. Peanut butter running low, but not quite low enough to justify buying more before the next paycheck. An apple that would serve as fruit if he didn't look too closely at the brown spot spreading across one side. The makings of a lunch that would keep Grace fed until dinner if Ethan packed it carefully and she ate everything without complaint. He pulled out bread and began constructing the sandwich with the precision of an engineer maximizing limited resources. Peanut butter spread thin enough to see the bread's texture underneath covering edge to edge, so Grace wouldn't notice that there was less than usual. Apples sliced to remove the brown part, arranged to look abundant on the small plate from the dollar store set that was missing two pieces but still functioned adequately. And then the most important part of the daily ritual, the element that mattered more than nutrition or presentation or any of the purely functional aspects of lunch preparation. Ethan pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser, the cheap kind from the discount grocery store that dispensed 3 when you pulled for one, and retrieved a pen from the junk drawer where writing implements accumulated alongside rubber bands and twist ties and all the other small necessities of household maintenance. The napkin wasn't much to look at. Plain white paper that would disintegrate if it got wet, bearing the logo of a grocery chain that had gone out of business 2 years ago. But words transformed it into something more valuable than the penny. It had cost something that transcended its humble materials and became the daily proof that Grace's father saw her, knew her, believed in her, even when the world seemed designed to make her feel invisible. Ethan wrote carefully despite exhaustion that made his handwriting waver. Have a great day, Grace. Mrs. Patterson told me your science project on plant photosynthesis is the best she's seen in 15 years of teaching. Keep shining. You're going to change the world someday. Love always, Dad. The words were true. Mrs. Patterson had stopped him at pickup last week to rave about Grace's understanding of complex biological processes, her ability to explain scientific concepts in ways that made them accessible to 6-year-old peers, the questions she asked that showed a mind already working at levels most adults never reached. She's gifted, Mr. Carter. You should consider testing her for the accelerated program. The city has scholarships for families who Ethan had cut her off politely because discussing his daughter's giftedness meant discussing resources they didn't have, opportunities that required applications and fees and transportation to magnet schools across the city and all the infrastructure that poverty made impossible. Better to keep Grace in the neighborhood school where she could walk 3 blocks without Ethan having to arrange complicated morning logistics around jobs that started before school did. But the words still mattered. Grace needed to know that her intelligence was visible, valued, a gift that transcended their economic circumstances. She needed the daily reassurance that her father noticed her achievements even when he was working too much to attend parent-teacher conferences or school plays or the science fair, where her photosynthesis project had won first place in a competition Ethan learned about secondhand from Mrs. Martinez. He folded the napkin with the same precision he brought to folding parachutes back when his life had depended on things being folded exactly right. Military training leaving permanent marks on neural pathways that associated precision with survival. The napkin went into the lunch bag alongside the sandwich and apple, and the lunch bag went into the refrigerator where Grace would find it in the morning before school. Ethan knew his daughter would read the note at lunch, sitting alone at a cafeteria table because the other kids had learned she was poor, and poverty was somehow contagious in the social ecosystem of elementary school. She would read his words and smile, and carefully fold the napkin to bring home, adding it to the shoebox under her bed where she kept every note he'd ever written. 167 notes so far. One for every school day since Julia died, a paper archive of a father's love measured in daily affirmations that cost nothing and meant everything. This was how Ethan stayed present even when work kept him absent. This was how he fought against the statistical inevitability of children raised by overwhelmed single parents in underfunded schools, in neighborhoods where poverty concentrated like toxic sludge. This was his weapon against a world that wanted Grace to understand from age 6 that she was less than worth, less than deserving of less than children whose parents could afford better zip codes and private schools and all the accumulated advantages that money purchased. The exhaustion hit like a physical weight as Ethan turned off the kitchen light and moved toward his bedroom. 22 hours awake now, running on caffeine and desperation, and the knowledge that sleeping meant the alarm would come too soon and the cycle would start again. Manufacturing plant, then delivery route, then repairs, then midnight, then Grace's shoes needing attention, then 2 a.m., and somehow it was always 2 a.m. in Ethan Carter's life, always the darkest hour when hope required the most effort to maintain. His bedroom was small enough that the bed, a mattress on a frame purchased from a second-hand store that specialized in furniture other people discarded, dominated the space entirely. Clothes hung in a closet that had lost its door before Ethan moved in. A lamp from the dollar store sat on a nightstand that had been Julia's grandmother's, one of the few pieces that survived the downsizing from their old two-bedroom apartment to the smaller, cheaper version. Ethan didn't bother undressing beyond removing his work boots and the jeans that smelled like gasoline from the delivery truck. The Red Sox t-shirt he'd slept in for the past 3 nights was good for one more night because doing laundry cost quarters they didn't have, and the laundromat was 6 blocks away, and hauling clothes there meant finding time that didn't exist. He set the alarm on his phone for 4:30 a.m., 4 hours and 14 minutes from now, enough time for sleep that wouldn't quite refresh but would keep him functional through tomorrow's shift. The phone was 3 years old, screen cracked from being dropped on concrete battery, holding charge for maybe 6 hours if he didn't use it much. Another thing that needed replacing on a timeline that kept getting pushed back because newer models cost money, and this one still technically worked. In the darkness, lying on sheets that needed washing but wouldn't get washed until the weekend, Ethan closed his eyes and tried to quiet the mental calculator that never stopped running. Tomorrow's delivery route would bring in $63 if he hit the per-package bonus. Saturday's repair job for Mrs. Martinez's refrigerator would add 40. Sunday, he'd promised to help the Johnsons fix their furnace for 60 more. $163 by Sunday night, which meant he could buy the new shoes Grace actually needed instead of sewing the old ones again, except her winter coat was getting too small, and winter was coming, and coats cost more than shoes, and the calculations spiraled into impossible choices that haunted the boundary between waking and sleep. Julia's face appeared in his mind the way it always did in these moments. Not the hollow-cheeked, ravaged version from her final days when cancer had consumed everything soft and left only angles and agony, but the laughing version from their wedding day when she'd been 23 and he'd been 21, and the world had seemed full of possibility. That didn't come with price tags they couldn't afford. Still fighting, he whispered into the darkness the same words he'd whispered every night for 3 years. Still keeping our promise. Still making sure Grace knows she matters. Sleep came reluctantly, pulling him under into dreams that mixed memory and anxiety in proportions that left him waking exhausted even when he managed to sleep. 40 floors above Boston in a penthouse apartment where floor-to-ceiling windows transformed the city into an illuminated map of other people's lives. Victoria Hayes stood watching lights reflect off harbor water while her stomach twisted with pain. She'd been managing for 8 months through a combination of prescription medication and sheer stubborn refusal to acknowledge that her body was failing. The view cost $11,000 per month, plus association fees that doubled the number, but bought access to amenities. Victoria never used the gym with personal trainers. The rooftop garden where residents grew herbs they'd never cook with the concierge service, that arranged restaurant reservations and theater tickets, and all the small conveniences that wealth made possible. The apartment itself was beautiful in the sterile way that interior designers created when given unlimited budgets and minimal direction. White walls and modern furniture, and art that had been selected for investment value rather than aesthetic appeal. Victoria hated it, had hated it since Owen died, and the space transformed from home into museum, every surface a reminder of shared life that ended too abruptly and left her alone in rooms designed for two. But moving men admitting that she couldn't handle living with ghosts and admitting weakness wasn't something Victoria Hayes did not in business, and certainly not in the personal life she kept carefully separated from the professional persona she projected. 30 years old, CEO of Hayes Development Group, net worth estimated at $83 million depending on how you valued the company and whether you counted liquid assets versus equity holdings. Featured in Forbes 30, under 33 years running. Boston Magazine's most powerful women list every year since Owen's death. The Ice Queen according to business reporters who found her boardroom style intimidating and her refusal to discuss her personal life frustrating. The nickname amused Victoria in a distant way because they thought they were insulting her, when actually they were describing her superpower, the ability to make decisions based on logic rather than emotion, to cut through sentiment and identify the most efficient path forward, to operate with the cold calculation that built billion-dollar companies from ambitious blueprints. Owen had understood that the ice wasn't natural, but constructed protective coloring that let a woman navigate rooms full of men who assumed her gender made her weak until her competence proved them wrong repeatedly and forcefully. But tonight the ice was cracking under pressure that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with biology that refused to respect her authority. The pain had started as minor discomfort 6 months ago, the kind of digestive upset that could be attributed to stress or bad lunch choices or the general wear of running a company that employed 400 people whose livelihoods depended on Victoria's decisions. She'd ignored it because acknowledging it meant doctor's appointments and tests and the possibility of diagnosis that would make her vulnerable in a professional environment that consumed weakness like sharks consume blood and water. Then the discomfort became pain. Then the pain became episodes that doubled her over in private moments, bathroom stalls during board meetings, her office after everyone went home, the shower where water could mask the sounds of distress she refused to voice where anyone could hear. Then the episodes became more frequent, progressing from weekly to daily, to the current state where pain was her constant companion, and the moments of relief were notable for their rarity. Victoria's doctor, a woman she'd chosen specifically because female physicians were statistically more likely to take women's pain seriously, had recommended an endoscopy after the initial consultation revealed symptoms consistent with peptic ulcer disease. The word ulcer had sounded manageable, something that could be treated with medication and lifestyle changes that Victoria had no intention of implementing, because changing her lifestyle meant admitting that something was wrong. The endoscopy had revealed not an ulcer but gastritis, severe enough that bleeding was inevitable if she didn't address the underlying causes which the doctor had identified with clinical precision as stress and irregular eating patterns and the kind of punishing work schedule that destroyed digestive systems designed for regular meals and adequate sleep. She'd written prescriptions for proton pump inhibitors and H2 blockers and scheduled follow-up appointments that Victoria attended irregularly because admitting she needed ongoing medical monitoring felt like surrendering to weakness. For 6 months, the medications had worked well enough. The pain became manageable rather than debilitating background noise, rather than consuming focus. Victoria learned to recognize the warning signs, the burning sensation that preceded episodes, the nausea that suggested she'd pushed too hard without eating, the dizziness that meant her blood pressure was dropping because internal bleeding was stealing red blood cells faster than her body could replace them. Tonight, all the warning signs were present and intensifying despite the medication she'd taken an hour ago. The burning had become searing. The nausea had progressed to the edge of vomiting. And the dizziness suggested that something had shifted from chronic problem to acute crisis, the difference between managing illness and experiencing medical emergency. Victoria pressed her hand against her abdomen and felt muscles rigid with tension, her body's involuntary response to pain it couldn't escape. The reflection in the window showed a woman who looked successful. Black silk pajamas that cost more than most people spent on entire wardrobes, diamond earrings she'd worn to a charity gala 3 weeks ago, and forgotten to remove hair that maintained its professional styling even at 2 a.m. because twice-weekly appointments with colorists and stylists made maintaining appearance effortless. But success was just surface cosmetic achievement that masked the reality of a 30-year-old widow, raising a 4-year-old daughter alone while building a company, and hiding illness and maintaining the fiction that she had everything under control when actually control was an illusion she projected with decreasing conviction. Sophie was asleep in the next room door, closed against the sounds of her mother's distress. 4 years old and already learning to exist quietly to minimize her needs to understand that mommy had important work that couldn't be interrupted by childish demands. Victoria tried to compensate scheduled quality time, hired the best nannies money could buy, arranged educational experiences and play dates and all the infrastructure of enriched childhood that wealth made possible. But guilt remained her constant companion because she knew that what Sophie needed wasn't experiences or nannies, but a mother who was present rather than perpetually distracted by the next crisis demanding attention. The pain intensified sharply, a spike that made Victoria gasp and double over one hand, bracing against the window while the other clutched her stomach, as if external pressure could somehow contain internal bleeding. This wasn't manageable. This wasn't background noise. This was the acute crisis her doctor had warned about, the moment when chronic condition became emergency, requiring immediate intervention. Victoria's phone sat on the kitchen counter 20 feet away, distance that suddenly seemed vast when walking required coordination her pain-racked body couldn't quite achieve. She stumbled towards it, vision blurring at the edges in a way that suggested blood pressure, dropping fast, and fumbled the device with hands that shook despite her determination to maintain control. The contact list was organized alphabetically by first name because Victoria had never bothered changing the default settings, and because alphabetical made sense when you weren't thinking clearly. Luke Harrison was her personal assistant, lived 10 minutes away, had handled midnight emergencies before, when board crises required immediate attention. She tried to focus on the screen, but her vision kept doubling, letters shifting in ways that made reading impossible. Her finger pressed what she thought was Luke's contact, and the phone began dialing, while Victoria sank to her knees on marble tile that was cold and hard and unforgiving against bones that suddenly felt too fragile to support her weight. The call connected. Victoria tried to speak, but pain stole her breath, left her gasping into the phone like someone drowning in air. Words finally came desperate and unclear. "Help me, please. I'm stuck. I can't." A voice on the other end, male and alert, in a way that suggested the person wasn't sleeping. "Who is this?" Victoria's mind scrambled for explanation, for coherent sentences that would communicate emergency without revealing the extent of her vulnerability. But clarity was escaping, along with consciousness, and in the gap where logic should have operated, memory surfaced unbidden. Owen's voice from 2 years ago, lying in their bed during one of the conversations they'd had after his diagnosis, made death feel proximate. "If anything happens to me and you need help, real help, the kind where your life depends on someone showing up, there's a man you should call. Ethan Carter. He was my best friend. He saved my life once, and he'll save yours if you need him, because that's who he is." Victoria had promised to remember the name, had saved the contact information Owen gave her, even though she'd thought the conversation was paranoid planning for disasters that wouldn't happen. Owen was healthy. Owen was careful. Owen wasn't going to die in some industrial accident that turned routine building inspection into tragedy. But Owen had died anyway, and now his voice was in her head, giving instructions she barely understood, through pain that was consuming rational thought. The words came out as desperate whisper. "You have to come. Owen said you would help." Ooh, sure. Then consciousness slipped away, and Victoria collapsed fully onto the cold marble floor, phone still clutched in her hand, while 40 floors below the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to individual crises playing out in expensive apartments where wealth couldn't prevent suffering. 8 years earlier, in a different life, when Ethan Carter was 26 and stupid enough to think he understood fear, training exercise was supposed to teach recruits how to navigate collapsed structures without becoming casualties themselves. The Boston Emergency Rescue Team took training seriously because inadequate preparation killed rescuers with depressing regularity, and the department had built an elaborate simulation facility designed to replicate every variety of structural failure their teams might encounter in the field. The building collapse simulator was 3 stories of reinforced concrete and adjustable hydraulics that could create realistic debris fields, unstable floors, confined spaces that required specialized extraction techniques. It looked like a war zone, rubble everywhere, exposed rebar dust so thick it coated your lungs and turned breathing into conscious effort. The scenario that day involved navigating through the ground floor to locate mannequins representing trapped civilians, then extracting them through routes that required both physical strength and spatial reasoning to identify paths that wouldn't trigger secondary collapse. Ethan had been cocky. That was the word Owen used later when they were reviewing what went wrong, and Ethan couldn't argue because cocky was accurate. He'd been the fastest recruit in their class, the one who completed confined space drills in record time, the one who scored highest on the written exams that tested knowledge of structural engineering principles and rescue techniques. Being fast and smart had made him careless, and careless in rescue work was just suicide with extra steps. The concrete slab fell because Ethan had ignored the warning signs that experienced rescuers would have recognized the cracking sound that meant hydraulic pressure was building, the slight vibration that indicated structural instability, the dust falling from above that suggested movement in materials that should have been static. He'd been focused on reaching the mannequin trapped under debris 15 feet away, so focused on the objective that he'd missed the context, and context was what kept you alive when buildings tried to kill you. The slab was maybe 800 pounds of reinforced concrete edges, jagged from simulated fracture, descending with the speed that gravity imposed on massive objects. Ethan saw it falling, understood immediately that he couldn't outrun it, tried to dive sideways, but the confined space didn't allow for sideways, and the slab caught him from the waist down, pinning him against rubble that had been carefully arranged to simulate realistic debris field, but which became terrifyingly real when it was crushing your legs. The pain was immediate and comprehensive, the kind of agony that made coherent thought impossible and reduced existence to pure sensation. Ethan couldn't feel his legs, which meant nerve damage or severed spinal cord, or a dozen other catastrophic injuries that meant wheelchairs and disability, and futures that evaporated under concrete weight. He tried to breathe, but the position compressed his diaphragm, made drawing air feel like pulling against elastic that was stretched to breaking. Panic set in with chemical swiftness, adrenaline flooding his system, heart rate spiking to levels that made his chest hurt, vision narrowing to tunnel that contained only pain and fear, and the terrible understanding that he was going to die in a training exercise, that his mother would get a folded flag, and a speech about sacrifice, that this stupid mistake would be the last thing he ever did. The radio crackled, and Owen's voice came through calm in a way that felt obscene given the circumstances. "Ethan, I need you to focus on my voice, just my voice. Everything else can wait. Can you hear me?" Ethan tried to respond, but pain made speech impossible, left him gasping into the radio with sounds that were barely human. "I'm going to take that as yes. Now, listen carefully. You're going to be okay. The team is working to get that slab off you, but it's going to take time because we need to do it carefully or we'll make things worse. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to breathe with me. In through your nose, hold for 3 counts, out through your mouth. We'll do it together. In, 2, 3, hold, 2, 3, out, 2, 3. The breathing pattern was something they'd taught in basic training, a technique for managing stress responses when situations spiraled beyond control. Ethan had dismissed it as theoretical nonsense when instructors described it, but now with Owen's voice providing structure and his own body threatening to shut down from shock, the pattern became lifeline. In through the nose. The air felt thick with concrete dust, but it was air oxygen reaching lungs that were starved for it. Hold for 3. His chest expanded against the pressure, fighting for space. Out through the mouth, carbon dioxide making room for the next breath. Owen kept talking, voice steady and unhurried, despite the fact that Ethan could hear other team members shouting instructions, hydraulic equipment being positioned, the organized chaos of rescue operation that was probably moving with appropriate speed, but felt glacially slow when you were the one pinned under concrete. "That's good. You're doing good. Now I need you to tell me about the pain. Where is it worst? Can you feel your toes? Wiggle them for me if you can." Ethan couldn't feel his toes, couldn't feel anything below his waist except generalized agony that suggested extensive damage. His attempt to communicate this came out as strangled sound that Owen interpreted with the skill of someone who'd done this before. "Okay, no feeling below the waist. That's actually not as bad as it sounds. Could be the position cutting off circulation rather than nerve damage. We'll know more when we get you out. Right now I need you to keep breathing with me. In, 2, 3, hold. 2, 3, out. 2, 3. For 45 minutes, Owen maintained that steady rhythm, never wavering, never showing fear or doubt or any of the emotions that must have been present, because Ethan later learned that the situation had been much worse than Owen's calm suggested. The slab had fractured during placement, meaning any attempt to lift it risked pieces breaking off and crushing Ethan completely. The team had needed to construct elaborate shoring to stabilize the slab before they could begin an extraction, and the whole operation had been one miscalculation away from turning training exercise into fatality. But Owen never communicated any of that urgency. His voice remained steady, providing the plan that transformed Ethan's panic into something manageable. Breathe, count, hold, release. Focus on the immediate task rather than the overwhelming context. Survive the next breath, then the next until surviving became continuous rather than moment by moment. When the hydraulic jacks finally lifted the slab and hands pulled Ethan free, he was shaking so violently that standing was impossible. Owen caught him, held him upright, with one hand gripping the back of his neck in the way soldiers did when words weren't adequate for the moment. You did good, brother. Kept it together when your body wanted to quit. That's all you can do when the world comes down. Keep it together until your team reaches you. Ethan's voice shook as badly as his body. I failed. I panicked. If this had been real, you'd have done exactly what you needed to do, stayed alive until help arrived. Panic is just fear without a plan. I gave you a plan. Next time you'll have your own. They had sat together in the locker room afterward while EMTs checked Ethan for injuries that turned out to be surprisingly minor: deep bruising, temporary nerve compression, no fractures or permanent damage beyond the psychological scars that came from understanding how quickly death could arrive when you made mistakes in situations that didn't forgive carelessness. Owen had bought him coffee from the machine that dispensed liquid that was technically coffee, in the same way that the simulator was technically a building functionally accurate, but missing essential qualities that made the real thing meaningful. They'd sat drinking terrible coffee while Owen explained something that Ethan had never forgotten. The job isn't about being fearless. Anyone who tells you they don't feel fear in situations like that is either lying or sociopathic. Fear is appropriate response to life-threatening circumstances. The job is about having a plan for what you do with the fear. You breathe. You focus. You take the situation apart into manageable pieces, and you handle one piece at a time until you've handled them all. How do you stay that calm? How do you keep your voice steady when everything's falling apart? Owen had smiled, tired and genuine. I don't stay calm. I perform calm. There's a difference. Inside, I'm as terrified as anyone, but outside, I project the calm that other people need to borrow until they find their own. That's leadership in crisis situations: not being unafraid, but being willing to act like you're unafraid so that other people have something to hold on to when they're drowning in fear. That conversation had shaped Ethan's entire approach to rescue work. For the next 6 years, he practiced that performance of calm until it became second nature, until his voice stayed steady even when his heart was racing, until he could assess disaster scenes and make decisions and coordinate extractions while some part of his mind remained terrified. But functional terror didn't prevent competent action. Owen had saved his life that day, but more than that, Owen had taught him how to save other lives by mastering the performance of competence under pressure. The lesson had served Ethan through hundreds of calls, car accidents, and building fires and medical emergencies, where staying calm meant other people stayed alive long enough to reach definitive care. But the lesson had its limits. 2 years ago, when Owen Hayes died in an industrial building collapse, and Ethan wasn't there because he'd taken the day off after losing teammate Rodriguez to a warehouse fire the week before the performance of calm had shattered completely. Ethan had been at home with Julia, trying to process the trauma of watching a friend and colleague burn to death in a structure they'd been sent to clear, when his phone rang with news that Owen had gone into a building that everyone knew was unstable, had saved 11 workers who were trapped when construction shortcuts caused catastrophic failure, had gone back for a 12th worker, despite radio warnings that secondary collapse was imminent. The building had come down while Owen was inside. The team had recovered his body 6 hours later, crushed under tons of concrete that no amount of calm breathing could have survived. Ethan had listened to the recordings afterward, Owen's final radio transmissions, that someone in the department had leaked against protocol, but which everyone on the team listened to anyway, because you needed to know, needed to understand how death came when it came. Owen's voice had been steady until the end, performing calm, even when he must have known that the groaning sounds above him meant the ceiling was coming down. That this time there would be no rescue operation because he was the rescue operation, and sometimes rescuers died when the people they were trying to save couldn't be saved fast enough. The last thing Owen said, voice still steady despite the sound of concrete beginning to fail. "This is Hayes. I'm trapped in the southeast corner. If anyone's listening, if Ethan's listening, I could use you, brother." Ethan had listened to that recording 50 times, 100 times, until the words were carved into his memory with the acid of guilt that never fully healed. Owen had called for him, had died calling for him. And Ethan hadn't been there because he'd been too weak to show up for shift after Rodriguez died, had let fear make him stand still when Owen's last lesson had been that fear was just inadequate planning. He'd quit the team the day after Owen's funeral, couldn't handle the responsibility anymore, couldn't walk into burning buildings knowing that the person next to him might not walk out, couldn't perform calm when his insides were screaming that death was coming for all of them eventually, and staying on the job just meant giving it more opportunities to collect. The quitting had felt like relief for approximately 48 hours. Then it had felt like cowardice. Then it had felt like betrayal of everything Owen had taught him about facing fear with plans instead of retreat. For 2 years, Ethan had carried the weight of that failure alongside all his other weights. Julia's death, Grace's needs, poverty's endless demands, until the burden became so familiar that he stopped noticing it was there. But he never stopped hearing Owen's voice in his head. "When someone needs help, you move. You don't think, you just move." Ethan had stopped moving, had let fear make him stand still, had failed the final lesson his best friend tried to teach him. The phone's vibration at 2:03 a.m. pulled Ethan from sleep that wasn't quite sleep, the shallow dozing that came when exhaustion made rest necessary, but anxiety made rest impossible. For a moment he lay disoriented in darkness, trying to identify the sound that had woken him, his brain cataloging possibilities with the systematic approach that rescue training had ingrained: fire alarm, Grace crying, something breaking in the apartment's endless list of things that needed repair. Then the phone vibrated again, and Ethan's hand found it on the nightstand screen. Brightness, painful in the darkness. Unknown number, 2:03 a.m. Every instinct screamed that answering was mistake because calls at 2 a.m. were never good news, were drunk dials, or scammers, or disasters that required responses Ethan wasn't equipped to provide from a bedroom in a falling-apart apartment while his daughter slept in the next room. But muscle memory from rescue days overrode rational caution. Calls at 2 a.m. meant someone needed help. And the 6 years when Ethan's job was answering those calls had created neural pathways that activated before conscious thought could intervene. His thumb accepted the call, and his voice functioned on autopilot, even though his brain was still catching up to being awake. "Hello." The voice on the other end was female, panicked, barely coherent, through gasps that suggested pain or fear or both. The sound triggered immediate assessment mode that Ethan thought he'd left behind when he quit the team: respiratory distress. Possible shock needed immediate evaluation to determine severity. "Help me, please. I'm stuck. I can't." Ethan was already sitting up, feet finding the floor, body responding, before his conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. His voice shifted into the calm authority that had once commanded emergency scenes, the performance of competence that Owen had taught him. "Who is this? What's your location?" The woman's breathing was rapid and shallow in a way that suggested hyperventilation or panic attack or physical injury that was restricting normal respiratory function. Ethan's mind ran through diagnostic possibilities while waiting for response that would provide context for the distress he was hearing. "You have to come. Owen said, Owen said you would help." The name hit Ethan like physical impact, stopping his breath and his thoughts and his ability to process anything beyond the single impossible syllable. Owen. Owen Hayes. Dead 2 years. How could this stranger know that name? How could she possibly understand that invoking Owen's name would make Ethan grab his jacket and run out the door without asking another single question? His voice came out sharp, focused, slipping back into emergency response mode that had served him through 6 years of disaster scenes where hesitation killed people and decisiveness saved them. "Where are you? Give me an address." The woman provided an address through waves of pain that made her voice break between words. Ethan's brain processed the location automatically: downtown Boston, Beacon Hill, 20 minutes from his apartment, if traffic cooperated, and maybe 30 if it didn't. The neighborhood was wealthy in a way that meant Ethan had never had reason to visit it, where monthly rent exceeded his annual income, and where people like him were only present as service workers or delivery drivers passing through on their way to somewhere else. "I'm coming. Stay on the line." But the call had already disconnected, leaving Ethan holding dead phone in darkness, while questions cascaded through his mind faster than answers could form. Who was this woman? How did she know Owen's name? Why would Owen have told anyone to call Ethan when Ethan had abandoned the team and failed to show up when Owen died calling for him? Why now at 2 a.m. on a Thursday that had been indistinguishable from every other exhausted Thursday in Ethan Carter's life? None of the questions had answers, but all of them would have to wait, because Owen's name meant dropping everything and moving, because even dead Owen had authority over Ethan's actions in ways that the living world never quite managed, because debt to the person who saved your life didn't expire when they died and actually intensified because you could never repay them directly. Ethan pulled on jeans that he'd discarded hours earlier, grabbed the Red Sox jacket that had been Julia's favorite because she'd grown up in Fenway's shadow, and baseball was religion in her family. His keys were where he always left them, on the hook by the door that he'd installed himself after the landlord refused to replace the broken one. His wallet went into his back pocket, despite the fact that he had maybe $20 cash, and credit cards that were maxed out, because wallet meant identity, and identity might matter if this turned out to be a situation requiring official intervention. Mrs. Rosa Martinez lived next door in apartment 3B, close enough that Ethan could hear her television through the walls when she stayed up late watching telenovelas that reminded her of the Cuba she'd left 40 years ago. He knocked urgently, the kind of knocking that communicated emergency without being loud enough to wake the entire floor, and counted the seconds until she answered, because every second was a second that the woman on the phone was suffering whatever crisis had made her call. The door opened after 15 seconds that felt like 15 minutes, and Mrs. Martinez stood there in a bathrobe that had probably been expensive when she bought it in 1985, and was now worn soft with decades of washing. Rosary beads hung from her hand in the way that suggested she'd been praying before sleep, and her expression shifted from confusion to concern as she registered Ethan's face. "Mijo, what's wrong?" Ethan's Spanish was terrible, despite living next door to Mrs. Martinez for 3 years and receiving regular lessons she insisted on providing, but he understood that mijo meant something like, "my son," and carried the warmth of affection that made her more family than neighbor. "Emergency. I need you to watch Grace. Please." Mrs. Martinez didn't ask questions, because questions could wait until crisis was resolved, and because she understood that single parents needed community that would show up at 2 a.m. without demanding explanations. She simply nodded and shuffled toward Ethan's apartment in slippers that made soft sounds against hallway carpet that needed replacing. "Go. I stay with Grace. You do what you need to do." Ethan wanted to explain, wanted to provide context that would make this midnight departure make sense, but explanation required time he didn't have, and understanding he couldn't provide, because he didn't understand himself why Owen's name had made him respond with such immediacy. He settled for squeezing Mrs. Martinez's shoulder in gratitude that couldn't be verbalized, then ran for the stairs because the elevator was slow and unpredictable, and stairs meant control. The truck was where he'd left it, in the parking lot behind the building windows, already developing frost because November in Boston meant winter was coming, and his truck's heating system worked sporadically when it worked at all. The engine coughed on the first try, caught on the second, and Ethan pulled onto empty streets while his mind raced through possibilities that all led to questions without answers. Owen's name. A woman he'd never met invoking Owen's name like a password that granted access to Ethan's immediate response. The address in Beacon Hill where people with money lived, lives that didn't intersect with the lives of people like Ethan, except in service relationships where the wealthy paid the poor to maintain the infrastructure of their comfort. Owen's face appeared in Ethan's memory with painful clarity, the way he'd looked during their last conversation 6 months before he died, sitting in a coffee shop in Davis Square, talking about life after rescue work, because Owen had transitioned out of the department into corporate safety consulting. He'd been happy, excited about the work, about using his expertise to prevent disasters, rather than responding to them about building something with the woman he'd married 3 months earlier. In a wedding, Ethan had been too consumed by Julia's cancer treatment to attend. She's incredible, Ethan. Smart and driven. And she sees the world the way I do, as problems that need solving rather than chaos that needs managing. We're going to build something together, something that matters. Ethan had been genuinely happy for his friend, even through the fog of grief that came from watching Julia deteriorate. Owen deserved happiness after years of carrying other people's disasters, deserved a partner who understood his drive to fix broken things, deserved a future that didn't end in concrete collapse. But Owen hadn't gotten the future he deserved. He'd gotten crushed under tons of rubble while trying to save one more person, and Ethan had gotten the guilt of surviving when better men died. The drive to Beacon Hill took 23 minutes because Boston traffic never truly slept, and because Ethan drove carefully despite urgency, because getting pulled over for speeding meant delays he couldn't afford and tickets he couldn't pay. The neighborhood announced itself through the gradual improvement of the urban landscape, potholes giving way to smooth pavement, graffiti, disappearing buildings, transitioning from functional to architectural statements designed to impress. The address was a glass tower that rose 30 stories above the harbor, its facade reflecting city lights in ways that made the building look like it was made of crystallized wealth. A doorman stood in the lobby behind glass doors that probably cost more than Ethan's truck, and Ethan was acutely aware as he parked in the circular drive that he looked exactly like what he was working class, exhausted out of place in a neighborhood where monthly condo fees exceeded his annual income. The doorman moved to intercept him as Ethan approached the entrance. Professional concern that was really class-based suspicion dressed in customer service language. But Ethan's rescue training ticked in before the doorman could speak, posture and voice conveying authority that came from years of commanding emergency scenes where seconds mattered and protocol was obstacle to overcome. Medical emergency apartment 804. I received a call. Let me through. The doorman hesitated, evaluating Ethan with eyes that had been trained to identify threats and finding someone who looked poor but it sounded competent. The hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds before professional judgment decided that preventing legitimate emergency response was worse risk than allowing potential intruder into building. 8th floor, elevators on your right. Ethan ran for the elevator, the lobby's marble floors and expensive art, and the whole elaborate infrastructure of luxury registering as peripheral detail that didn't matter when someone was suffering crisis severe enough to make them call strangers at 2 a.m. The elevator rose with smooth silence that spoke to engineering quality his budget would never experience, depositing him on the 8th floor in a hallway where even the carpet spoke of money spent on appearances. Apartment 804's door was a jar gap of maybe 2 inches that suggested either interrupted exit or inability to close it properly. Ethan pushed it open and stepped into chaos that his training immediately organized into triage categories. Furniture knocked over ottoman on its side table displaced throw pillows scattered. Lamps shattered on hardwood floors that gleamed with the particular shine that came from professional cleaning services. And in the center of the disaster, a woman on her knees clutching her abdomen, face so pale it looked translucent, covered in cold sweat that suggested shock or blood loss or both. But on her, a little girl, maybe 4 years old, dark hair and pajamas printed with cartoon characters, tear-streaked face, showing the particular terror that came from watching a parent suffer and being powerless to help. "Mommy, Mommy, please wake up." The child's voice was breaking with sobs that came from deep terror, the kind of crying that suggested she'd been at this for a while and was running out of hope that crying would make anything better. Ethan ran to the woman and dropped to his knees beside her, hands already reaching for her wrist to check pulse before his conscious mind had fully caught up to the situation. The physical assessment was automatic muscle memory from 6 years of practice, making evaluation faster than thought. Skin ice cold. Pulse rapid and thready, maybe 120 beats per minute. Breathing shallow and irregular, respiratory rate elevated, but depth insufficient for adequate oxygenation. These were textbook signs of hypovolemic shock, the cascade of physiological responses that occurred when blood volume dropped too low to maintain adequate circulation. The most likely cause, given the abdominal pain, was internal bleeding, probably gastric, based on the way she was clutching her stomach and the pallor that suggested she'd been bleeding for a while. This was acute crisis requiring immediate hospital intervention, and every second of delay increased the risk of irreversible organ damage or death. Ethan's voice came out calm and steady, despite the adrenaline that was making his hands want to shake. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, confusion and pain written across features that suggested she was fighting to maintain consciousness. Her lips moved, but sound came out barely audible, words slurred with the effort of speaking through trauma that was shutting down non-essential systems. Who, who are you? My name is Ethan Carter. You called me, or someone called me using your phone. I'm here to help. Can you tell me what happened? The woman tried to answer, but pain cut through whatever she'd been about to say, doubling her over with a moan that made the little girl beside her start crying harder. And then the hallway erupted with noise, doors opening along the corridor as residents woken by the commotion emerged to investigate. Ethan heard voices before he saw people, the particular tone of wealthy individuals who were accustomed to being insulated from other people's crises and were annoyed that insulation had failed. An older man in a bathrobe that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent appeared in the doorway, face showing concern that was rapidly being replaced by suspicion as he registered Ethan's presence. The worn jeans, the faded Red Sox jacket, the whole working class aesthetic that marked him as not belonging in this building, this neighborhood, this economic stratum. "What's going on here? Who are you?" A woman in silk pajamas pushed past him, gasping dramatically when she saw the woman on the floor. "Is that Victoria Hayes? Oh my God, what happened?" But then their eyes landed on Ethan, really landed on him, took in the details that marked him as other in this space where wealth was assumed and poverty was invisible, except when it served you coffee or delivered your packages and the narrative began forming before anyone asked for facts. The older man's expression hardened with suspicion. That was really class prejudice dressed as concern. "Wait, who is this man? Victoria, do you know him?" Victoria, the woman on the floor, now identified by name, tried to speak, but pain was winning, stealing her ability to communicate anything beyond the moans that suggested she was losing the fight to stay conscious. The woman in silk pajamas crossed her arms in a posture that radiated judgment. "A single dad from the poor side of town, and the CEO calls him in the middle of the night. This is ridiculous." Ethan heard the words catalog them as information about how these people saw him and how they would continue to see him, regardless of what he did or said, and dismiss them as irrelevant, because their opinions mattered exactly zero compared to the life or death situation unfolding on their expensive hardwood floors. Another voice joined the chorus, a man in designer loungewear that screamed money in the particular way that expensive casual wear always did. "If she's sick, she should call a doctor, not some random man." The little girl looked up at Ethan with desperate, pleading eyes that were every terrified child's eyes, the universal expression of needing an adult to make the scary world make sense. "Please help my mommy. Please." Ethan's focus narrowed to the woman in front of him, to symptoms that were textbook clear to anyone with medical training. He'd seen cases like this before, dozens of them, and he knew with certainty that came from experience that this was acute gastric bleeding, that minutes mattered, that standing here arguing with wealthy neighbors about his right to be present was the difference between this woman living and dying. "Someone call 911, now." The command came out with the authority of someone who'd spent years coordinating emergency responses, and for a moment the crowd hesitated as if they might actually comply. Then the woman in silk pajamas laughed with the particular mockery of someone who'd never been desperate enough to accept help from anyone who didn't match their social class. "You think you're a doctor." Ethan didn't waste time on explanations that these people wouldn't believe anyway. His hand was already pulling his phone from his pocket, fingers dialing 911 with practiced speed while his eyes never left Victoria's face, monitoring her breathing and color for signs of further deterioration. The 911 operator answered on the second ring, professional voice asking for the nature of the emergency. Ethan spoke with clinical precision that came from hundreds of similar calls made over 6 years when his voice had been the link between chaos and intervention. "I need an ambulance at 2247 Beacon Street, apartment 804. Female, approximately 30 years old, presenting with acute abdominal pain, cold sweats, rapid shallow breathing, signs of hypovolemic shock." Possible gastric hemorrhage. She needs immediate transport. There was a pause on the other end, brief silence, while the operator processed information that included medical terminology civilians didn't typically use. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from routine to urgent, the change that happened when dispatch realized they were talking to someone who knew exactly what they were describing. Ambulance is dispatched ETA 6 minutes. Sir, do you have medical training? Yes. The single word transformed the operator's approach questions, shifting from basic to specific as she tried to gather additional information that would help paramedics prepare for what they'd find on arrival. But Ethan was barely listening because Victoria's breathing was becoming more labored, and the little girl was clutching his arm with grip that suggested she'd decided he was safety in a situation where safety was rapidly disappearing. The hallway went silent. Every wealthy neighbor who'd been judging and mocking and dismissing him stood frozen and finally understanding that this wasn't entertainment or drama, but actual life and death crisis playing out in front of them. Ethan felt their stares, heard the quality of silence that came from people realizing they'd been catastrophically wrong about someone, but their embarrassment was as irrelevant as their initial mockery. Victoria's eyes were starting to lose focus, consciousness slipping away as blood pressure dropped too low to maintain adequate brain perfusion. Ethan carefully moved her onto her side in the recovery position, the technique that prevented aspiration if she vomited, and that improved circulation by relieving pressure on major vessels. He grabbed a throw blanket from the nearby couch and covered her critical step in treating shock that most civilians wouldn't know, and that might be the difference between maintaining her blood pressure enough to survive until the ambulance arrived. Stay with me, Victoria. Help is coming. Just stay with me. His voice was calm, despite the urgency he felt the performance of competence that Owen had taught him 8 years ago, when Ethan had been the one who needed someone else's calm to survive. Victoria's eyes met his for just a moment, something passing between them that might have been recognition or gratitude, or just the simple human connection of one person helping another in their darkest moment. Then her eyes rolled back and consciousness slipped away entirely, leaving Ethan monitoring her pulse and breathing while counting the seconds until the ambulance arrived and wondering how many of those seconds she had left. The little girl Sophie he'd heard Victoria call her earlier screamed when her mother went limp. Ethan caught the child before she could try to shake Victoria awake, pulling Sophie against his chest with one arm, while keeping his other hand on Victoria's pulse point, feeling the rapid flutter that indicated a heart working overtime to compensate for blood volume that was critically low. It's okay, sweetheart. I'm not going to let anything happen to your mommy. The ambulance is coming, and they're going to take her to the hospital where doctors can help her. But right now, I need you to be brave for her, okay? Sophie nodded against his chest, her small body shaking with sobs that were quieter now, but no less terrified. Ethan held her while monitoring Victoria's vital signs, the practiced multitasking of someone who'd learned to manage multiple aspects of crisis simultaneously because emergency response required you to be everywhere at once. The neighbors who'd been so quick to judge were backing away now, shame written across faces that had been confident in their superiority minutes earlier. Ethan didn't care about their embarrassment or their apologies that would inevitably come once the crisis passed. All that mattered was keeping Victoria alive for the 6 minutes until professional medical care arrived, and in that moment surrounded by the trappings of wealth that meant nothing when biology failed. Ethan Carter was exactly what Owen had seen in him 8 years ago, someone who showed up when help was needed and who stayed calm when everyone else was losing their composure. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder. The paramedics arrived in exactly 6 minutes with equipment that transformed Victoria's living room into mobile trauma bay, stretcher, oxygen IV lines, threading into veins that were already collapsing from blood loss. They worked with practiced efficiency that came from responding to emergencies, every shift asking Ethan questions that confirmed he'd given dispatch accurate assessment and that his intervention had probably bought Victoria the time she needed to survive transport. One paramedic, maybe 30, built like someone who lifted patients for a living, looked at Ethan with recognition that came from professional to professional. You the caller. Yeah. Textbook assessment. You work in medicine. Used to emergency rescue. Not anymore. The paramedic nodded understanding, written across his face, because everyone in emergency services knew people who'd burned out, who'd left the work. because watching people die took toll that eventually exceeded what human psychology could sustain. He didn't ask why Ethan had quit or what had driven him away from work he was clearly trained for. Instead, he just said what mattered in the moment. You saved her life tonight. 10 more minutes and we'd be calling the medical examiner instead of transporting. They lifted Victoria onto the stretcher with movements choreographed through thousands of similar transfers, one paramedic managing the IV bag, while the other stabilized her head and neck. Sophie stood frozen, watching her mother being taken away, small face showing terror that 4-year-olds shouldn't have to carry, but which life sometimes imposed anyway. Ethan scooped the child up before she could protest or try to follow the stretcher. Sophie's arms wrapped around his neck with desperate strength, her face buried against his shoulder, while her body shook with sobs that had exhausted themselves into hiccuping silence. We're going with her, sweetheart. You won't be alone, I promise. The lead paramedic hesitated, professional concern about protocols that limited ambulance occupancy during transport. But something in Ethan's expression, the determination that came from understanding what it meant to be terrified and alone, made him nod toward the ambulance doors. Get in, but stay out of our way while we work. Ethan climbed into the ambulance, still holding Sophie, settling into the jump seat, while paramedics continued their assessment. Victoria's blood pressure was critically low, consciousness gone entirely, vital signs suggesting that internal bleeding had progressed beyond what field intervention could manage. This was race against time and biology was winning by margins that made Ethan's training scream warnings about outcomes that medical personnel never spoke aloud in front of family members. The ambulance pulled away from the building with sirens that shattered the 3 a.m. quiet, and through the rear windows, Ethan watched the crowd of wealthy neighbors standing in the hallway, their faces showing shame and confusion, and the dawning realization that they judged someone catastrophically wrong based on nothing but his clothes and economic status. He didn't care about their embarrassment, didn't care about vindication or apologies or any of the social dynamics that played out in the wake of crisis. All that mattered was the woman on the stretcher, fighting for her life, and the child in his arms who needed someone to perform calm, even when calm was just well-practiced lie. Boston General's emergency room blazed with fluorescent brilliance that made 3 a.m. feel like noon halls crowded with overnight crises that big cities generated with depressing regularity. Doctors and nurses moved with a controlled urgency that came from triage systems designed to process human suffering into manageable categories. Immediately life-threatening, seriously injured, can wait another hour. Victoria went straight to trauma bay. Sophie and Ethan left in waiting area that smelled like industrial cleaner and fear. The child had finally stopped crying, exhausted into silence that was somehow worse than sobs, because silence suggested she'd moved past hope into resignation that 4-year-olds shouldn't understand yet. A nurse approached with clipboard and expression that tried for sympathetic but mostly achieved professional distance. Sir, are you the patient's husband? No, I'm... Ethan paused, unsure how to explain his presence in language that would make sense to hospital bureaucracy. I received a call. She was in crisis, I responded. The nurse looked at Sophie sleeping against his chest, then back at Ethan with confusion that suggested this scenario didn't fit any of the categories her training had prepared her for. We need to contact her family. Do you have information about next of kin? I don't even know her last name. She called me. Said someone named Owen told her to. That's all I know. The words hung in the air, insufficient explanation for why a stranger was holding a patient's child at 3 a.m. in an emergency room where every other person present had clear relationship to the crisis that brought them. Before the nurse could ask follow-up questions that Ethan couldn't answer, a voice came from behind them. Hayes, her name is Victoria Hayes. Ethan turned to see a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, despite the hour slightly disheveled, in ways that suggested she'd received urgent call and dressed quickly. Her face carried the particular expression of someone who dealt with emergencies as part of their job, but who was personally invested in this particular crisis. I'm Patricia Lynn, Victoria's executive assistant. Building security called me about the ambulance. Patricia's eyes moved from the nurse to Ethan to Sophie and back to Ethan, assessment happening in real time as she tried to piece together what had occurred. Her gaze lingered on Ethan's face with growing recognition that suggested she was connecting pieces of puzzle he didn't understand. Who are you? Ethan Carter. Victoria called me tonight. She was in medical distress. I came to help. Patricia's eyes widened in shock so profound that it momentarily broke through her professional composure. Ethan Carter Owens Ethan. The question hit like physical impact because nobody had called him Owens Ethan in 2 years. Not since the funeral where Ethan had stood at the back and avoiding condolences from people who knew he'd quit the team and who probably blamed him for not being there when Owen died. Hearing the phrase now from a stranger who somehow knew about their friendship made the past collapse into the present in ways that left Ethan struggling to maintain the calm he was performing for Sophie's benefit. How do you know that name? Before Patricia could answer, a doctor emerged from the trauma bay, mid-40s, graying at temples, wearing the particular exhaustion that came from overnight shifts in emergency medicine. His expression was grave but not defeated, the face of someone delivering news that could have been worse, but wasn't good. Family of Victoria Hayes. Patricia stepped forward quickly. I'm here on her behalf. How is she? The doctor's next words confirmed everything Ethan's training had suggested about the severity of Victoria's condition. She had a severe gastric hemorrhage. We've stabilized her for now, but she's lost significant blood volume. If she'd arrived 10 minutes later, he paused, the kind of pause that medical professionals used when they were about to tell you someone almost died. We might not have been able to save her. Whoever made that 911 call and gave us the preliminary diagnosis probably saved her life. All eyes turned to Ethan. Patricia stared with expression that mixed awe and confusion, and something that looked like understanding dawning. The doctor extended his hand with respect that came from one medical professional to another. Thank you. Your assessment was textbook perfect. You obviously have training. Ethan shook the offered hand, but said nothing, because explaining that he'd been trained for exactly these situations but had quit because he couldn't handle the trauma felt like confession that didn't belong in this moment. Sophie stirred in his arms, looked up at him with eyes that were Grace's eyes, every frightened child's eyes. Did you save my mommy? Ethan's throat tightened with emotion he was too tired to suppress entirely. His voice came out softer than he'd intended. The doctor saved your mommy. I just got her, brought her here. But Sophie shook her head with the absolute certainty that children sometimes possessed about things that adults tried to complicate. You saved her. You're a hero. Over the next hour, more people arrived. Security detail from Hayes Development Group, men in suits, who looked like they'd been roused from sleep to deal with crisis that threatened their employer. Board members whose presence suggested Victoria's medical emergency had business implications that couldn't wait until morning. And surprisingly shamefully, many of the neighbors from Victoria's building who'd been so quick to judge and mock Ethan. The older man in the expensive bathrobe approached hesitantly, shame written across features that had been confident in their superiority an hour ago. Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly based on nothing but appearances. You saved Victoria's life while I stood there making accusations. I'm ashamed of myself. Ethan stood because remaining seated felt wrong when someone was trying to apologize, and because standing gave him something to do with the energy that exhaustion and adrenaline crash were creating in his muscles. He shook the man's hand because holding grudges required energy he didn't have for people whose opinions had never mattered anyway. What matters is that she's okay. That's all that matters. The woman in silk pajamas came next, voice subdued in ways that suggested genuine remorse rather than performative apology. I said terrible things about you, called you. She couldn't finish the sentence, apparently unable to voice the classist assumptions she'd made about someone whose poverty showed through his clothes. You're a hero, and I treated you like a criminal. I'm so sorry. Ethan's response was gentle because these people had already learned their lesson in the worst possible way by almost watching someone die because their prejudices delayed appropriate response. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to her when she wakes up. I'm not the one who was hurt by your words. But his humility only made them feel worse, made them understand that they'd misjudged someone fundamentally good based on economic markers that had nothing to do with character or competence. They'd been so quick to dismiss, so certain that poverty equaled incompetence, and he'd proven them wrong in every possible way. A nurse who'd been part of Victoria's trauma team pulled Ethan aside, voice low, with the kind of respect that came from recognizing excellence in high-pressure situations. I've been doing emergency medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone stay that calm during crisis. Most people panic when someone they care about is in danger. Where did you learn that emergency rescue? You learned to shut off panic and focus on what needs doing. The nurse nodded slowly, understanding that came from working alongside people who'd mastered the performance of competence under pressure. Well, you saved her life tonight. I hope you know that. After another 90 minutes, Victoria was moved to a private room in the ICU, stable, sedated, out of immediate danger, but still requiring monitoring for complications that could arise from blood loss severe enough to require transfusion. Patricia arranged for Sophie to stay with her mother, and Ethan helped settle the exhausted child into a chair beside the hospital bed. Sophie looked up at him with eyes that showed fear beyond her years. "You're not leaving, are you?" Ethan hesitated, because he should leave, should go home to Grace, who would wake in 4 hours wondering where her father had disappeared to, should return to the life that didn't include penthouse apartments and CEO rescues and entanglement with a world he'd left behind when he quit the rescue team. But looking at Sophie's frightened face, remembering the promise he'd made in the ambulance, he couldn't simply abandon her to process her mother's trauma alone. "I'll stay a little longer." Sophie smiled, small, tired, grateful, and grabbed his hand with trust that felt unearned but sacred nonetheless. Patricia pulled Ethan aside before he could settle into the other chair, her voice carrying urgency that suggested what she needed to show him couldn't wait. "I need you to see something. It's important." She led him to a quiet corner of the waiting area where families gathered during overnight vigils and pulled out her phone with the careful handling of someone about to reveal information that would change how someone understood their world. The screen showed a scanned document handwriting that made Ethan's chest constrict with recognition even before his conscious mind processed whose words he was reading. Owen left this letter with his will, very specific instructions about when to share it and with whom. Ethan began reading and the world tilted beneath him. Owen's letter, Patricia. "If anything ever happens to me, I need you to do something. There's a man named Ethan Carter. He was my best friend. I saved his life once during a rescue operation that went wrong. If Victoria or Sophie ever need help, if they're ever in danger, find Ethan. He'll never let them down. He's the most reliable person I've ever known. Promise me you'll remember his name. Promise me you'll find him if they need him. Owen." Ethan stared at the words until they blurred with tears he hadn't let himself cry, since Owen's funeral grief and guilt and confusion combining into emotion too complex to name. His hands were shaking when he finally looked up at Patricia. I didn't know Owen got married. I didn't know he had..." His voice broke. "I lost touch with him after I left the team." Patricia's expression held something that looked like compassion mixed with understanding that came from having watched Owen grieve the loss of his friend to burnout and trauma. Owen Hayes was Victoria's husband. He died in a rescue operation 2 years ago. Industrial building collapse at a construction site. He was trying to save workers trapped inside. The information hit in waves. Owen married Owen, a father, Owen dead, doing exactly what he'd always done, which was run toward danger when everyone else ran away. Ethan had known about Owen's death, had attended the funeral from the back row, where nobody would try to offer condolences he didn't deserve. But he hadn't known about the family Owen left behind, hadn't understood that his best friend had built an entire life in the 2 years after Ethan quit. "He never forgot you, told Victoria about you, said if anything ever happened to him, if she or Sophie were in trouble, to find you, to call you. But she didn't call me. She called someone else, didn't she?" Patricia pulled up another file on her phone showing Victoria's contact list with Ethan's number saved alongside someone named Luke Harrison. She keeps emergency contacts listed by first name. Tonight, when the pain hit and she could barely think, she tried to call her assistant, Luke Harrison, who lives nearby. But her vision was blurred and she hit the wrong contact, Ethan Carter. Your number was still saved in her phone from 2 years ago when Owen gave it to her. Ethan felt reality reorganizing itself around this new information. The understanding that Victoria's call hadn't been random, but had been enabled by Owen's planning, that even dead Owen had been trying to take care of his family by making sure they had access to the one person he trusted completely. So it was a wrong number, a mistake. Patricia's voice carried conviction that suggested she'd spent considerable time thinking about this. "No, it was fate. Owen made sure your number was in that phone, made sure Victoria would find you if she needed you. And tonight, even through pain and fear and confusion, some part of her remembered. Some part of her reached for the name Owen trusted most." A nurse appeared in the hallway, voice professional but gentle. Mr. Carter, Miss Hayes is waking up. She's asking for you. Ethan stood on legs that felt uncertain and walked to Victoria's room while his mind tried to process everything he'd learned in the past 5 minutes. Sophie was asleep in the chair, exhausted beyond what consciousness could sustain. Victoria's eyes were open, still groggy from sedation, but focused on him with intensity that suggested she was fighting through medication to stay present. You came. The words were barely whisper, but they carried weight that simple statement one shouldn't have possessed. Ethan pulled a chair close to her bedside, sat down carefully to avoid jarring the equipment that monitored her fragile stability. Yes, you saved us. I did what I could. Victoria's eyes filled with tears that spilled over, despite her obvious attempt to maintain composure. And Ethan understood that this woman, this CEO, this ice queen that business press wrote about, was just someone who'd almost died and who was grateful to be alive in ways that transcended professional facades. Owen told me about you, said you were the bravest person he knew, said if I ever needed help, really needed help, to find you. Ethan's throat was too tight for immediate response. When words finally came, they carried 2 years of guilt compressed into a single sentence. He saved my life once. I owed him everything. He loved you like a brother. The phrase broke something inside Ethan that he'd been holding together through sheer stubbornness, grief he'd been refusing to process because processing meant accepting that Owen was gone and that Ethan had failed to be there when Owen needed him most. I loved him too, his voice cracked. And I'm sorry I wasn't there when he needed me. Victoria reached out with her uninjured hand and took his, the gesture costing her visible effort, but apparently mattering enough to push through exhaustion and pain. He wouldn't want you to carry that guilt. He would want you to live, to be happy. Ethan looked down at their joined hands, hers soft despite IV line threading through it, his calloused from work that destroyed bodies, and tried to find words for the complex emotion of owing debt to a dead man, whose family now needed help Ethan barely felt equipped to provide. I don't know if I remember how to be happy. Victoria's grip tightened with surprising strength for someone who'd nearly died an hour ago. Maybe we can figure it out together. They sat in silence that felt less awkward than it should have, two people connected by someone they'd both loved and lost, finding unexpected comfort in shared grief that made them allies in ways that had nothing to do with the crisis that had brought them together. Finally, Ethan spoke the words that felt like commitment to something he didn't fully understand, but which felt important in ways that transcended rational calculation. I'll stay for as long as you need me, I promise. Victoria smiled through tears. Thank you. And in that hospital room surrounded by beeping machines and the soft breathing of a sleeping child and the antiseptic smell that all hospitals shared, something shifted between them. Not romance, both too recently traumatized and grief-stricken for that, but recognition that they were both broken people trying to survive losses that should have destroyed them, and that maybe surviving together was easier than surviving alone. 3 days later, Victoria was discharged with strict orders, rest medication, follow-up appointments that she would need to actually attend instead of rescheduling around board meetings. Ethan had barely left the hospital during that time, going home only to check on Grace and reassure his daughter that everything was fine, that Daddy had helped someone who needed help and would be home soon. Grace had questions, with the particular insight of 6-year-olds who knew when their parents weren't telling the complete truth. Why do you keep going to see that lady, Daddy? Ethan knelt so he was at her eye level, the gesture Julia had always used when she wanted Grace to understand something important. Her husband was my friend a long time ago. He helped me when I really needed it. Now his family needs help, and I'm trying to give it to them. That's what we do, remember. We help people. Is she going to be my new mommy? The question hit with force that nearly knocked him backward. Ethan hadn't even considered that angle, hadn't let his mind wander anywhere near implications that 3 days of hospital vigil might suggest to a child who'd been without a mother for 3 years. No, sweetheart, we're just helping someone who needed help. That's all. But Grace's next words planted seed that Ethan couldn't quite uproot despite his best efforts. Mommy's been gone 3 years, Daddy. Maybe it's okay if you're happy again. Victoria returned to her penthouse with security increased and Sophie clinging to her hand like the child was afraid her mother would disappear if physical contact broke. The board members who'd visited the hospital had questions written across their faces about Victoria's health, about whether she was fit to continue as CEO, about succession plans that respectful people didn't voice, while the person in question was still recovering, but which were clearly being discussed in private conversations that Patricia reported with clinical precision. Richard Ashford had been the most vocal about his concerns, showing up at the hospital on day 2 with flowers that felt performative and sympathy that sounded rehearsed. Victoria, the board is worried. This collapse, it raises questions about your ability to handle the stress of the position. We need to discuss contingency planning. His tone suggested concern, but his eyes calculated, and Victoria had been in business long enough to recognize power plays disguised as worry. Richard was VP of Operations, 52 years old, 15 years with the company, and longer than that with Owen, back when they'd both worked rescue operations before Owen transitioned into private sector safety consulting. He carried himself with the particular entitlement of someone who believed his history with the deceased gave him authority over the living. Victoria had ended the conversation quickly because arguing with Richard never changed his mind, only gave him ammunition for the campaign she knew he was building. But his words lingered like smoke, polluting thoughts she'd been trying to keep focused on recovery rather than corporate warfare. Ethan returned to his own life the day Victoria was discharged, climbing back into the truck that smelled like gasoline and driving to the manufacturing plant where his shift started in 20 minutes. The past 3 days felt surreal in the way that emergencies always did once adrenaline faded. Had he really spent 72 hours in a hospital, keeping vigil over a woman he'd never met before? She called him at 2 a.m. Had Sophie really fallen asleep in his lap 3 separate times, trusting him with the unconscious certainty that children reserved for people who'd proven themselves safe? The manufacturing plant paid $18 an hour for work that made his back scream. By hour 6, troubleshooting equipment that broke because the company refused preventive maintenance. The delivery route started at 4 p.m., $63. If he hit bonus targets that required speed, the truck's bald tires made dangerous. And waiting at home was Grace, who'd spent 3 nights with Mrs. Martinez and who had questions about where Daddy kept disappearing to and why he came home smelling like hospital antiseptic. This was reality. The hospital had been aberration, temporary excursion into a world where people like Ethan only appeared as service workers delivering packages or fixing equipment. Victoria Hayes and her penthouse apartment and her billion-dollar company existed in different universes than the one where Ethan sewed his daughter's shoes at 2 a.m. and counted dollars to determine whether they could afford both milk and bread this week. But 2 days after Victoria's discharge, Patricia called with a request that pulled Ethan back toward the orbit he'd been trying to escape. "Can we meet? I have something Owen wanted you to see. Something I've been holding on to until the right time." They met at the same coffee shop where Ethan had once met Owen to talk about life after rescue work, the kind of place where coffee cost $2 instead of $7 and where people wore work clothes instead of business suits. Patricia brought a box that she handled with the care of someone carrying precious cargo. "Owen left this with me. I'm the executor of his estate. I needed to decide when was the right time to show you." Inside was Owen's rescue team journal, leather-bound, worn from years of field use, filled with handwriting that made Ethan's chest ache with recognition of loops and slants that had once annotated rescue plans and now existed only as archive of a mind that no longer thought. Patricia had marked specific pages with sticky notes, and Ethan opened to the first with hands that trembled despite his determination to maintain composure. Owen's journal, March 12, 2016. "Ethan saved 6 people today from a pileup on I-90. Some kid from Wellesley, 20 years old, drunk, crossed the median doing 70, and created chain reaction that involved 8 vehicles. Should have been catastrophic. Would have been, except Ethan went vehicle to vehicle in weather that would have frozen anyone else pulling people out while EMTs worked triage. He doesn't see it in himself. Doesn't recognize that what he does isn't normal, isn't what most people would do when faced with cars on fire and injured people screaming. He thinks he's just doing his job. But there's difference between doing job and running toward fire when everyone else runs away. Ethan runs toward fire. That's who he is, fundamentally the person who shows up when showing up might get you killed. I'm lucky to have him as partner. Team is lucky to have him, period. Boston is safer because Ethan Carter wakes up every morning and decides that other people's lives matter more than his own safety. Ethan couldn't read any more tears blurring words that felt like messages from the dead Owen's voice, speaking across 2 years of silence to tell him things he desperately needed to hear, but which arrived too late to change anything that mattered. Patricia's voice was gentle when she spoke. There are 47 entries about you in this journal, spanning 6 years. Owen documented every major call you worked together, every time you did something that impressed him, every moment where he saw qualities in you that apparently you couldn't see in yourself. She turned to another marked page. Owen's journal, June 3rd, 2017. Lost Rodriguez yesterday. Warehouse fire flashover caught him before he could get out. Whole team is devastated because Rodriguez was good people, funny, competent. The kind of guy who made terrible shifts bearable just by being present. Ethan quit today. Said he can't handle the pressure anymore. Can't watch another teammate die. Can't keep doing work where the best case scenario is everyone survives and worst case is somebody's family gets a flag and a speech about sacrifice. I don't blame him. Grief after losing someone you worked with every day is brutal. It's not just loss, it's the knowledge that you could be next. That every shift could be the last one, that saying goodbye to your family in the morning doesn't guarantee you'll see them at night. Part of me wants to ask him to stay because he's the best partner I've ever had, and because the team needs people like him who don't quit when situations get difficult. But bigger part of me understands that he's reached his limit and that pushing past limits is how you break people permanently. I'll miss having Ethan watch my back, but I don't blame him for leaving. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you can't do something anymore. I just hope he knows that leaving doesn't make him coward. It makes him human. Ethan's voice came out strangled when he finally managed to speak. He didn't hate me for quitting. He never hated you. He worried about you, missed you, but he understood why you left and he respected your decision even when it meant losing his best friend. Patricia flipped to another page, this one dated several months after Ethan had quit. Owen's journal, November 8, 2018. Ethan sent a gift for Sophie's first birthday even though he hasn't spoken to me in over a year. A rescue teddy bear, the kind we used to give to scared kids during evacuations, the ones with the fire department patches and the soft fur that soaks up tears. He remembers the work and what it meant and why we did it, even though it cost him more than most people will ever understand. The card was simple. Congratulations on your daughter. Hope she grows up knowing her father is a hero. But the fact that he remembered it all says everything about who Ethan is. Maybe one day he'll forgive himself for leaving. I already have. There was never anything to forgive. Patricia pulled out one more page, this one dated 6 months before Owen died. Owen's journal, February 14th, 2019. Told Victoria about Ethan tonight. Showed her his photo from the team days, the one from the commendation ceremony after the I-90 rescue, where Ethan looks embarrassed by the attention and like he wants to be anywhere except on stage receiving recognition for doing what he considers basic job requirements. Victoria asked why I keep talking about someone who quit someone I haven't seen in months. I said because he's my brother. And brothers don't stop being brothers just because life pulls them in different directions. I'm putting Ethan's number in Victoria's emergency contacts. She thinks I'm being paranoid. Maybe I am. But rescue work teaches you that the worst case scenario isn't theoretical, it's Tuesday. And if Tuesday comes and I'm not there, I need to know someone will answer when Victoria calls for help. Ethan will answer, because that's who he is, the person who shows up when showing up matters most. Ethan broke down completely. First time he'd cried since Owen's funeral grief that had been compressed into manageable box for 2 years, finally breaking through containment. Patricia let him cry without trying to offer comfort that would have felt hollow just sitting across from him in the coffee shop, while other customers pretended not to notice the man weeping over a dead friend's journal. When Ethan could finally speak, his voice was raw. I should have been there when he died. If I'd still been on the team. Patricia's voice carried firm conviction that suggested she'd spent considerable time thinking about this exact question. Then maybe you'd both be dead. That building collapsed in 8 seconds. Even you can't outrun physics. Owen knew the risks, made his choices, went back for that last worker knowing the structure might come down. Those were his decisions, not yours. She paused, then delivered information that recontextualized everything Ethan thought he knew about Owen's death. The person who was supposed to be on site that day was Richard Ashford, VP of Operations at Hayes Development now, but back then he was transitioning from rescue work into corporate safety consulting alongside Owen. Richard was supposed to do the building inspection that day. He called in sick. Ethan's mind processed this new information, trying to fit it into narrative that had always been simple. Owen died because Ethan wasn't there to watch his back. But if Richard was supposed to be there instead, if Owen had taken someone else's shift as favor, Owen took Richard's shift as favor. Richard had been out drinking the night before at some business dinner, woke up hungover, called Owen, and asked him to cover. Owen said yes because that's what teammates did for each other. Richard's been carrying that guilt for 2 years. And from what Victoria tells me, he's twisted it into something toxic, blaming her for pulling Owen away from rescue work, into corporate consulting, blaming you for abandoning Owen when he needed you, seeing himself as the only person who truly understands what Owen was. Patricia's next words carried warning that suggested she knew something about Richard's current activities. He's been building opposition on Victoria's board, trying to position himself to take over as CEO. Uses Owen's memory as justification, claims Victoria's decisions dishonor what Owen built, that the company should be run by someone who understood Owen's true values. He sees you as threat now that you're in Victoria's life. Be careful. That warning proved prescient when Victoria called Ethan 2 days later with invitation that felt dangerous in ways he couldn't quite articulate. I'd like you and Grace to come to dinner, at my place, just to say thank you properly. Ethan's first instinct was to refuse because accepting felt like crossing line from emergency responder to something else, something that might require reciprocation he couldn't afford financially or emotionally. But Grace had been asking about Sophie, the little girl from the hospital, the one who'd been so scared. Was she okay, and denying his daughter friendship because of his own discomfort seemed cruel. They went. The penthouse felt even larger with Grace in it, his 6-year-old daughter staring wide-eyed at marble floors and original artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows that showed Boston sprawling beneath them, like promise of everything Ethan couldn't provide on $42,000 a year. "Dad, is this how rich people live?" Grace whispered it like she was in museum, afraid to touch anything, and Ethan's heart broke because his daughter shouldn't have to feel like visitor in spaces where other children live naturally. Sophie appeared from her room, and the two girls stared at each other with wariness that children showed when adults were clearly trying to force friendship. Then Sophie held out a stuffed rescue bear, the kind Owen used to give to scared kids, and Grace's face transformed. "My daddy used to give these to kids. My first daddy did too." And just like that, the girls disappeared to Sophie's room, leaving Ethan and Victoria alone in living room that could have housed his entire apartment. Victoria didn't waste time on small talk, the directness that had made her successful CEO apparently extending to personal conversations. Hayes Development needs a director of emergency response and security, someone who understands crisis management, can train staff in emergency protocols, can design systems that keep people safe when things go wrong. The salary is $120,000 annually, full benefits, and there's a scholarship program for employees' children that would cover Grace's private school tuition. The numbers were abstract, disconnected from reality where Ethan existed. $120,000 was almost 3 times what he made working 3 jobs, and private school tuition alone probably exceeded his annual rent. That's charity. It's recognizing expertise. You saved my life. You assessed crisis in 30 seconds that would have taken medical professionals 10 minutes. You kept calm while everyone else panicked. That's exactly the qualification I need. I don't have corporate experience. I fix manufacturing equipment and deliver packages. I'm not qualified for... You were qualified enough to keep me alive until professional help arrived. That's the qualification that matters. Before Ethan could respond, the penthouse door opened and Richard Ashford walked in with the confidence of someone who still thought of himself as Victoria's trusted advisor, even though Owen had been dead for 2 years. "Victoria, we need to discuss the Q3 projections." He stopped when he saw Ethan's expression shifting from professional to hostile in the space between heartbeats. Richard was evaluating him the way the neighbors had evaluated him, finding him wanting, based on appearance that screamed poverty in spaces where poverty was invisible except as service role. "Who is this?" Victoria's voice was cool. "Richard, this is Ethan Carter. He's the one who saved my life 2 weeks ago." Richard's eyes narrowed with calculation that suggested he was connecting pieces into narrative that would justify whatever conclusions he wanted to reach. "The man from the news reports." His tone made it sound like accusation rather than identification. Richard turned to Victoria with barely concealed anger. "Victoria, can we speak privately?" In the kitchen, which was separated from living room by open floor plan that made privacy impossible. Richard's voice carried with clarity that suggested he didn't care if Ethan heard every word. "You're offering him a job. You don't know this man. This is nepotism, hiring your dead husband's friend out of guilt. The board won't approve this." Victoria's response was ice. "I'm the CEO. The board works for me." Richard's reply carried threat that wasn't even thinly veiled. For now, Ethan left without accepting the right offer, wouldn't accept it because pride was all he had left when money and security and everything else had been stripped away by circumstances that poverty made inevitable. Accepting Victoria's help felt like admission that he couldn't provide for his daughter on his own, and that admission was more than his ego could sustain. But that night, Grace asked a question that changed everything. "Dad, why did you say no?" Sophie's mom was being nice. "Because we don't accept handouts, sweetheart. We earn what we have." Grace's next words carried wisdom that 6-year-olds shouldn't possess, but which poverty sometimes taught early. "But you saved her life. Isn't that earning it?" Ethan had no response to logic that was irrefutable, so he just held his daughter and pretended he had answers to questions that were really about why the world was unfair, in ways that hurt people who didn't deserve hurting. 1 week later, Grace came home from school crying in ways that suggested something worse than scraped knees or failed tests. The story came out in fragments between sobs. Rich kids from private schools sometimes volunteered at Grace's underfunded public school for community service hours, and they'd learned about Ethan's rescue of Victoria Hayes through news coverage that had made the story minor sensation in Boston's business community. They said, "You're just a delivery guy," that we're poor, that I don't belong at their school even though Miss Victoria said I could go there. The cruelty was specific in ways that reflected parents' prejudices, children learning to measure worth in bank accounts and zip codes, and all the markers that separated people who mattered from people who didn't. Ethan held his daughter while she cried and understood with terrible clarity that his pride was hurting the person he was trying to protect. Grace deserved better than public school that was teaching to standardized tests because resources didn't exist for anything else. Deserved classmates who wouldn't mock her for being poor. Deserved opportunities that Ethan's $42,000 would never provide. The next day, Ethan called Victoria. "If the offer's still open, I accept." Victoria's relief was audible even through phone connection. "It is. And Ethan, thank you." 2 weeks after Ethan started working at Hayes Development, the Boston Business Journal published a story that had Richard's fingerprints all over it. Hayes Development CEO's rescue romance, savior, or opportunist. The article detailed everything. Ethan's 3 jobs, his debt, his lack of corporate experience, his friendship with Owen, the suspicious timing of Victoria hiring him weeks after he'd saved her life. Anonymous board member, obviously Richard, was quoted extensively about emotional decision-making and questionable judgment, and concerns about CEO's fitness to lead. The story went viral on business Twitter within hours. Memes about rescue romance. Think pieces about whether gratitude should influence hiring decisions. Stock analysts questioning Victoria's judgment. Hayes Development stock dropped 4% in a single day. Grace transferred to Sophie's private school the following week with scholarship Victoria had arranged, and the bullying intensified immediately. Rich kids who had learned prejudices from parents who had read the Business Journal article made sure Grace understood she didn't belong. "Your dad only has a job because Miss Hayes feels sorry for him. My dad says your dad is poor and trying to marry a rich lady." Grace came home crying every day for a week until Sophie, tiny 4-year-old Sophie, who'd learned courage from watching her mother face down boardrooms, stood up during lunch and said in voice that carried across the cafeteria, "Ethan saved my mommy's life. Your daddies just sit in meetings and talk about money." Who's the real hero? The bullying stopped, but the damage was done, and Ethan understood that accepting Victoria's help had dragged his daughter into warfare he hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully protect her from. The emergency board meeting happened 3 weeks after the Business Journal article, Richard having spent that time consolidating support among board members who believed Victoria's personal crisis indicated larger problems with her leadership. The evidence he presented was devastating because it was technically accurate. Victoria had been hiding her illness. She'd hired Ethan based on personal connection rather than executive search. The stock price had declined. Major clients were expressing concern about leadership instability. I propose we transition Victoria to Chairman Emeritus, an honorary position with no operational authority. I'll assume CEO responsibilities until we can conduct proper search for permanent replacement. Richard had the votes. 3 board members he'd been cultivating for months, convinced that Victoria was making emotional decisions that would destroy the company Owen had helped build. Victoria fought back with Data Ethan's emergency response protocols, the safety improvements that had already reduced workplace incidents by 18%. In 3 weeks, the expertise that came from 6 years of rescue work that corporate consultants couldn't replicate. But Richard had prepared his counterattack, the one that struck at Victoria's vulnerability rather than Ethan's qualifications. Ms. Hayes, can you explain to the board why you're so personally invested in defending an employee with 3 weeks tenure? The implication was clear, the suggestion that Victoria's judgment was compromised by personal feelings that had no place in boardroom decisions. The vote was 5-4 in Victoria's favor. She won barely, but Richard left the meeting with a smile that suggested he was just getting started. That night in the parking garage after the board meeting, Victoria confronted Richard with fury she'd been containing. I know what you're doing. You're trying to remove me so you can take over the company. Richard's mask finally slipped, 2 years of compressed guilt and resentment spilling out in words that had been building since Owen's funeral. Owen died because you pulled him into this soft corporate world. If he'd stayed in rescue work where he belonged, he'd be alive. This company should go to people who understand what Owen really was, a hero, not a businessman. Victoria's voice was steady despite the anger vibrating through her. Owen chose this life, chose business, chose me. You don't get to rewrite his choices. Richard's voice broke with emotion he'd apparently been suppressing for 24 months. I was supposed to be at that site. I was supposed to do that inspection. I called in sick because I was hungover from a business dinner, and Owen took my shift as a favor, and he died saving people I should have been there to save. The confession hung in the parking garage's recycled air. 2 years of guilt finally vocalized to the person Richard blamed for Owen's death, because blaming Victoria was easier than accepting his own responsibility. Every time I see this company, I see the place that killed him. And every time I see you with Carter, I see 2 people who abandoned Owen when he needed them most. Victoria's response was quiet but firm. Owen wouldn't want you destroying his family because you survived. He'd want you to honor his memory by supporting what he built, not tearing it down. Richard walked away without responding, but the confrontation had exposed the truth that Patricia had warned about. Richard's campaign wasn't really about protecting Owen's legacy. It was about managing guilt that had nowhere else to go except into destructive patterns that hurt everyone Owen had loved.